Hello, everyone, and welcome to our third week. We are looking today at the American political economy, and in this lecture, I'll take you through in the next two parts. There'll be some overview in this first part of some of the background, and we'll try to get into a little bit of the debate about what the perspective would be between the elite and popular Democrats. If you remember this crucial framework that we've been trying to argue and develop and introduce through this semester so far, between the elite and popular Democratic perspectives, we're going to try to see how these perspectives apply and relate to contemporary developments in the American political economy. And you see here in this opening slide the emblematic figure of the Walmart smiley face. And Walmart is a crucial case study for our talk this week, because Walmart, of course, exemplifies a sort of a really sort of essential aspect of the debate, which is the extent to which we want to have the economy governed by the so-called free market. And what you'll see as we go through the next few slides is that really there's a lot at stake in this. When Americans first developed their relationship and their attitude to the economy, the existing economy looked very different. It was a small agrarian country, market-based in the sense of small towns and bringing food to, agricultural products to the market, etc. Today's economy would be more or less unrecognizable, I think, to the founding fathers. So we have to consider the impact and significance of the emergence of very large corporations like Walmart, why they matter for our analysis of democracy in America today. Clearly, they have a huge role to play, and we'll be wanting to talk a lot about that role in the coming slides. Now, in this slide, which I've called the U.S. economy a snapshot, I just wanted to give you guys an insight into some of the things going on. Now, the division of labor here is to focus on the nature of the economy. Later on in the semester, we'll kind of come back to the economy. When we talk about popular movements, we'll talk a lot about the Occupy movement. We'll talk about people striking for minimum wage. There's a lot of, if you follow the news at the moment, there's fast food workers out on strike. Last year we had workers from Walmart out on strike, trying to look for fair pay, for equal pay. And that belongs in our lectures further down the line. Today, in this part and the next part, I'm going to be focusing mostly on the nature of the U.S. economy, and I'm going to try to talk about and focus on the place of corporations in our analysis. And I'm going to leave popular resistance and struggle against the power of corporations and also for higher wages to another class, which will come later this semester. In this snapshot, you can see we just have a little overview of some of the things going on in the American economy today. We have 50 million Americans living in poverty. That's very, very high for a developed country. We have 1/3 of the U.S. population, maybe not all of them living in poverty, but as poor. They officially classify as poor or nearly poor. That really is shocking for the richest country on earth. How is it possible that 1/3 of Americans are poor? There's a popular notion in America, because it's allegedly the land of opportunity. If you're willing to work hard, anyone can make it here so long as they work hard. And of course, there's many examples of people who have worked hard and who have made it work for themselves. But when you think about, for example, in racial terms, for example, the fact that there's a ratio of 3-to-1 among black children compared to white children of poverty, it really kind of gives you an indication of what the problem is. It's not so much that it's still impossible for Americans to work hard and get ahead, but that there are structural obstacles and difficulties that Americans face in trying to do that. Often it's to do with the color of their skin or the education they've received. And, if you're coming from a poor background, from a poor family, the structural obstacles are very, very obvious. Structure is a word that we can use to describe a situation that exists in our society where your ability to choose, your ability to engage in free action is constrained, in this instance, by lack of access to funds, by lack of access to credit. And it's for that reason, I think, that President Obama right now, recognizing this in his 2014 State of the Union address, called for a fair wage of $10.10 an hour, which is an increase from the $7.25 that currently prevails. He also, in that address, signed an executive order to raise the minimum wage for individuals working for the new federal service contracts to $10.10. And what that means is that if you are working for a service, for an agency, for a firm that contracts to the federal government, you will now be making this minimum wage. But of course, that's just a very narrow amount of people. It means an effective measure. Because as he said in the speech, if you cook for our troops, if you cook their meals or wash their dishes, you should not have to live in poverty. So what that means is, if you're a federal contractor employee, he's doing the best, I suppose, that he can do within the framework of the law to make sure that those people are not living in this poverty line. The minimum wage is a poverty wage. It hasn't changed in decades, the definition of poverty, at least. I'll get back to that in a moment, so don't let me get ahead of myself here. But it covers about 2 million low-wage workers. That's actually more than Walmart and McDonald's combined, which is relevant for our discussion, as you'll see. Does Obama's decision, does his action make much of a difference for Americans? Well, obviously, there's a lot of people that are not federal contractor employees. So it's really a symbolic gesture, but I think it does keep the spotlight on the issue of the minimum wage, which is out there at the moment. And as I'll be addressing in a further lecture later this semester, the issue of the minimum wage is certainly not going to go away anytime soon. Another thing that sort of I observed when I listened to that State of the Union address this year was how Obama, like so many other presidents, didn't really address the state of the economy for ordinary Americans. Sure, he's talking about poverty, but what's really interesting is that so many presidents frame their address to the condition that is faced by middle-class Americans. Middle-class Americans are kind of considered to be the voters. So presidents and politicians typically generally address their needs. The idea is to be able to report good things for middle-class Americans, and to help middle-class Americans is a sort of a constant mantra that American presidents will resort to. It begs the question, who speaks for the poor? There's a popular mantra in American media that the poor are lazy, that they're unwilling to work hard, and I think it's time really to sort of address that myth as somewhat silly. Everybody knows someone who takes advantage of welfare, maybe long-term unemployed. Maybe they spend some of their food stamps on things they shouldn't spend money on. But as we'll see in this lecture, the reality is that not actually compared to the cost that elite financiers and CEOs of large corporations burden the taxpayer with, the costs of welfare fraud are really minimal. Welfare fraud is not actually that widespread, and it is a kind of a propaganda campaign, if you will. It's just very, very interesting that we get so worked up and so upset about the fraud of the people who are on welfare seem to be carrying out compared to the fraud of the elites. As you learn reading people like Matt Taibbi, whose book you're reviewing this semester, is dealing with some of these issues. We have a sort of a very aggressive mindset when it comes to trying to police and regulate the poor. We don't have anything like this mindset when it comes to the people that cost us, in fact, much, much more money as taxpayers than the poor, and that is the elites. And why is that the case? It's hard to explain in a sentence or two, but Matt Taibbi does a good job throughout the length of his book. The outline for this lecture then, we're going to talk about Walmart and the future of the U.S. economy. Again, Walmart being a big sort of symbol of how the U.S. economy is run. It's emblematic and symptomatic of many of the issues that we are going to be discussing today. We want to talk about the political economy and democracy. We want to talk about corporate power and accountability. We want to talk about rising inequality. The political economy and civil society is a very important question. I'll talk about the roots of today's banking crisis. That's a little bit out of order. I want to move that topic up a little bit. I should have changed this slide. And then in conclusion, do we want to choose democracy and prosperity or a corporate free market system? Because, of course, the free market, while most Americans support it, doesn't seem to be operating the way it ought to be today, and the question is why. One of the hypotheses that we're going to put forward is that it's a lot to do with the power of corporations, not just in terms of their wealth, but their political power as well. In this slide, we address Walmart then and the future of the U.S. economy. Walmart is the most successful retailer in U.S. history. It's 370 billion annual turnover is something really to be marveled at. They're a very, very successful company, and they are in many ways the envy of a lot of other companies. But the question is, why is Walmart so successful? Their model is based on making their products cheap. Typically, they're 10% cheaper than the competition. That's why people go there. That's why people shop there. And the question is how. And in the blue box here, we have 5 basic reasons. Walmart employees work long hours for very low wages. They are on the minimum wage, whereas compared to unionized retailers like Costco that pay about twice that much, right? So working for Walmart, you are not going to make a lot of money. That's the bottom line. How does Walmart get away with paying its workers such a small amount of money? Well, Walmart tends to use what are known as union busting techniques. They actually don't allow unions, and they tend to actually try to weed out and fire people that they find in their ranks of employees who support unions. That's actually illegal in the United States of America, but it tends to go unprosecuted in Walmart for some reason. The third point is that Walmart tends to employ a disproportionate amount of women. In fact, 11% of all working women in the United States of America work for Walmart in some way, shape, or form. That's staggering. That means 11% of women in the workforce are employed in some way, shape, or form for Walmart. You wouldn't think Walmart was that big, but actually it is. It exists all across the land. So that's quite remarkable. Now, for a company that depends on the labor of women so much, it's important to remark that women earn, for equivalent labor of men, $5,000 less per annum. That's $5,000 less for a year's work. That's really impressive, or really interesting, I think, from a woman's perspective. Indeed, Walmart's workforce is 72% women, but those are mostly on the shop floor and in menial forms of labor. In fact, if you look at the salaried workforce, not the hourly workforce, you find that women are only 34%. So that means that women are not working as managers in Walmart. They're working on the hourly workforce, which means they're mostly on the shop floor. Another very important point to keep in mind when we talk about Walmart is that Walmart is engaging in playing the globalization game as best it can. Now, of course, everyone is playing this game, everyone from Apple to Google to you name it, right? You've probably read about Apple and Google's tax maneuvers in Ireland, and that the Congress and President are very interested in trying to find ways in which to bring back some of those taxes that are being sort of potential to taxes. I'm mincing my words here a little bit, but how the American economy is losing the potential to tax some of those profits by these companies locating overseas is interesting. But back to Walmart. Walmart tends to use a lot of overseas manufacturing, and we know that overseas, because these countries are poor and they're hungry for jobs, often these people have to work in fairly harsh labor conditions, right? Because unions are banned there. And so there's an irony there, I think, given that Walmart's sort of early branding was to do with the fact that everything was made in America. Indeed, Sam Walton, the founder of Walmart, his biography was called Made in America. So where are Walmart's Made in America values today? Seemingly they have disappeared in the name of profit. And then a final point that we can mention in terms of why Walmart is so cheap is to do with the term corporate welfare. This is an interesting term for people who get upset about poor people, buying beer with their food stamps or what have you. Actually, it's interesting that Walmart actually asks its workers to apply for food stamps. That is, it asks the public taxpayer to subsidize Walmart's workers' wages, which is, fascinating really when you think about it, because Walmart is a company that talks about the virtues of the free market and enterprise, free enterprise, values, it says, the spirit of entrepreneurialism. But actually, when it comes down to it, Walmart seems very, very desperate to find the lowest overheads possible so that it can pass on savings to its customers. And the way it does that is by taking the taxpayer dollar and getting those workers through, because they have such low wages, actively encouraging those workers to go out and file for food stamps to support their salaries from Walmart. So that means that Walmart is actually encouraging people to be on welfare in some way, shape, or form. To be more precise, to request public assistance. Indeed, studies have been done to try to establish what this costs the taxpayer, and it's been determined that for every Walmart that employs 200 people or more, it actually costs the taxpayer about $420,000 in public assistance. So add up all the Walmarts in the country, and then you get a sense of just how much the taxpayer is having to subsidize those very cheap jobs at Walmart. So it's a bit of a misnomer then. It's a bit of a false economy. We think we're saving money by buying our goods and services from Walmart, but actually we're paying more than we think because the price is partially hidden in our taxes that we pay. Another interesting aspect that emerged last year in terms of the way Walmart operates is that and of course fast food CEOs are no different here. It's not just Walmart in the particular case I'm about to discuss, but it's been determined that a lot of CEOs are claiming that a loophole in the tax code should allow them to deduct the costs of performance-based executive pay. So what that means is that the big bonuses that some of the CEOs of places like Walmart and fast food industries are getting they're claiming a tax subsidy themselves. So they're avoiding taxes on their large salaries. What might we conclude from all of this? Well, Walmart is a case in point. If the example of Walmart holds true across the country, then we can draw a conclusion. We can say that large corporations, on the one hand, preach the virtues of the free market. They publicize the free market. They lobby for the government to not regulate them and let the laws of the market dictate their operations. But actually, in fact, they suppress it. That is to say, they actually interfere with the logic of the free market. The special advantages that they get by being able to, for example, charge their employees or pay their employees such low wages are not advantages that are available to the small mom and pop stores of downtown Chillicothe, for example. In fact, the impact of Walmart on places like downtown Chillicothe is very dramatic because of the ability Walmart has, again through these taxpayer subsidies, to undermine the prices of the goods and services that these small mom and pop stores are able to provide. And we have to contrast that with the values, for example, of people like Henry Ford, and think about the civic values of people like Henry Ford. Back in the time that Ford Motor Company was established, Henry Ford was paying his workers enough money so that they could actually buy a Ford car. And the idea was that he wanted people to be wealthy enough to be able to do that. He wanted them to find a good middle-class lifestyle by working at Ford. Contrast that with Barbara Ehrenreich's story. Barbara Ehrenreich is a journalist who in 2001 wrote a book called Nickel and Dimed, where she recounts her story of trying to live on $7 an hour, which at the time in 2001 was the minimum wage that Walmart was paying its workers. And she recounts her year trying to live on this minimum wage, and basically says, it's impossible to live like this. You cannot pay rent, you cannot pay your bills, and it's just not a human existence. And so it's no surprise then that some towns like Blacksburg, Virginia, for example, which was in the news a couple of years ago, actually got together, the people of the town got together to make sure that their city government did not give Walmart a license to set up a store in the city limits. There was already a Walmart up the road in an adjoining town, which a lot of people from that town went to, but they didn't want the Walmart moving into the downtown area of this unique location where there was already a thriving sort of downtown commercial center full of small to medium-sized businesses. Those businesses simply would not have been able to compete with Walmart. And so the jobs, high-paying jobs, and a good, thriving community base was able to survive that. As we'll talk about later on in the lecture, it's important to remember that these towns are important civic centers, and civic life takes place in them. You meet your local shopkeeper, you talk about the news, you talk about common issues facing the community. When you are just going en masse to Walmart at different hours of the day, you don't have those encounters anymore, and you don't have a sense of ability to make your daily life part of your social fabric. You become much more anonymous as a consumer, and so many people worry about the erosion of American civic life as these big box stores open up. And you can think about Bridge Street in Chillicothe as an example of this. Contrast the life of people in Chillicothe 20-30 years ago with a thriving downtown to now, where all the jobs and retail has moved out to Bridge Street. And you can see quite clearly that people are not having those opportunities to encounter their neighbors anymore. So how does this Walmart case study speak to the tradition of thinking about democracy in America? We've already introduced our democratic debate in the last couple of classes. We've got some update on that then as it relates to the political economy. So first of all, I think it's important to identify what we can call here, borrowing from our textbook, the American consensus. That is to say, most Americans really do not sort of want to get rid of the market anytime soon. They're not communists, right? The vast majority of Americans are sort of opposed to what they understand as socialism or communism. Most Americans believe in private ownership of goods and services, private ownership of property, and the ability to freely circulate in the buying and selling of goods and services. That's a better way to put it. Private property then is a central value in American political life, and it's unlikely to be going away anytime soon. America is not becoming a socialist country and will not, I think, because the culture is so pro-market, that means that has an effect for us, right? So in terms of our analysis of the elite view and the popular democratic view, some might want to constrain the market a little bit, but that's only because they see the market as doing some harm, and they only want to constrain the market insofar as it's doing harm. So we shouldn't conclude from anything we're saying here that Americans are going to become socialist anytime soon. But we do have two positions to cover and address today. And as last week and this week and next week and all the weeks to come, we'll be contrasting the elite view and the popular democratic view. Now, the elite view is, and we'll go into this in more detail in the next slide, is that really there should be a strong separation between government and the market. The government should not be intruding into the marketplace very much, except merely to set some basic regulations. It should not be spending money in the marketplace more than it has to. And really, the market should be the domain where private individuals should be able to buy and sell goods and services. Popular Democrats, on the other hand, believe that there's some really big problems with the free market in an unconstrained sense. In fact, we've got three problems we can identify from the Popular Democratic perspective. That is, on the one hand, the prevalency today of unaccountable corporate power. We'll be talking in a little while about the so-called Citizens United case. But even before that, it's a reality. I think that anyone keeping their eye on political life today knows that there's a number of ways in which American corporations are, especially the large ones, tend to have an undue influence, disproportionate influence relative to the size of their populations on American government. So that's a factor, right? They have a large voice, they have a lot of influence on Capitol Hill and in local governments as well. And it's not clear to whom they are accountable. For example, in terms of environmental regulations, in terms of the amount of money they pay their employees, because they've been so successful in lobbying for deregulation of any structures that would make sure they are accountable. Later in this lecture, we'll be talking about the 2008 financial crisis, which I think is a huge example of exactly what we're talking about here. We'll also talk about the Enron crisis from before that, which is another great example. Another problem that I think the free market purists have difficulty addressing, and the Popular Democrats jump right in here, is the idea that we have growing inequality in the country. This is a country, despite the fact that it's the richest country in the world, has a huge gap and a growing gap between the rich and the poor. And the question is, how can American political life respond to that, to maybe make sure that that people who deserve an opportunity are getting that opportunity, people who are poor are getting good educations and quality healthcare so that they have an opportunity to make something for themselves in this life. And then finally, we have a concern that the free market, and we'll address this later in the lecture, might be encouraging individualism, individual egoism to be precise, making us concerned more about ourselves rather than our traditional civic values. We'll address this at the end of the lecture. But at the core of this, to come back to the main argument for now, for Popular Democrats, the major accusation, the major concern is that corporations have what Charles Lindbaum calls a privileged position in relation to the way the U.S. economy works. That means that they have a position of influence on the apparatus of government that, simply put, most Americans can never hope to have in their lifetimes. So if the government is being run more by the corporations and for the corporations, where do the people fit in? Where are their needs being served? Is America a land of opportunity for people who run, small mom and pop businesses, small enterprises, the small-time entrepreneur? This is the America, of course, that was envisioned at its founding. Does that America still exist, or have the corporations sort of, in a sense, despite the fact that they're preaching the values of the market, use the market to their own advantage to such an extent that they now have, as Charles Lindblom calls, a privileged position, politically speaking, vis-a-vis the apparatus of government. So let's go into detail now on some of these points, shall we? in this slide, we argue that there are two basic positions that we can outline, and we're going to detail them now in a little bit more than we did in the last slide. As we've argued, most Americans, in fact, see the free economy as something necessary for democracy, right? Most Americans have an interest. Even the so-called popular Democrats would still aver that that the government is something that we have in order to make sure there's law and order, right? So the government, in order to make sure law and order exists, is essentially a coercive entity, right? It can actually force people to do things. It can order police to use physical force on people, for example, to make sure they do things. And for most Americans, the market is the opposite of that, right? It's the sphere where people are able to act freely. And so for most Americans, this idea of freedom is intrinsically bound up with the marketplace, the concept of the marketplace. And it means that Americans tend to see political freedom almost as a kind of economic freedom, right? The market is not coercive. If the government is coercive, the market is not. Because why? Well, in the marketplace, no one's forcing you to buy or sell anything. It's your choice, right? And if you want to choose something else, you're welcome to do so. If you don't like the job you have, you're welcome to quit and go to another job. What's more, I would argue those who support the idea of the market as a separate domain of life tend to believe that the market actually polices itself as well. So it's a really important thing to remember. This idea, if someone's charging too much for a good or a service, for example, then people just don't shop there anymore. Others will find a way to sell those goods more cheaply. So the best thing government can do is to stay out of the market's way for the most part and let the market govern itself, right? So these are the elite democratic perspectives, that the free market basically is an extension of democracy, that markets maximize our freedom while minimizing coercive power in our lives, and that the markets are able to police themselves and they bring competition and efficiency to the way we live. And actually that if we don't live that way, if we don't follow the law of the market in most of our political forms of interaction, we will come up against, this is the final point from the elite Democrats' perspective, we're going to come up against the law of unintended consequences. And what this translates to, for example, in relation to welfare, is that the government really shouldn't be providing a lot of welfare. Why? Because it messes with incentive structures. If you are aggressively taxing people in order to provide generous welfare, you're going to mess with incentives. When an entrepreneur wants to go to work and invent something new and awesome, right, he's less likely to do that even if he's naturally talented at inventing, he's going to be less likely to be an inventor because of the disincentive of the high taxes. It's going to be the profit margin from an elite perspective that motivates the inventor to be an entrepreneur in the first place. Conversely, if you're giving a lot of generous welfare support to people who are unemployed, you're going to mess with their incentives to get a job. Because, well, after all, they're mostly motivated by the material bottom line. And if they're doing fine on welfare, they have no need to get a job, right? So from the elite democratic perspective, then, we have 4 very strong reasons why the political economy should not be interfered with by the government. And the question I suppose we have to ask is, while that all sounds very, very good, is it perhaps too good to be true? Now, I want to say something here. The majority of United States media and much of our education system is pretty much dedicated to espousing this elite democratic viewpoint. The elite democratic viewpoint is deeply entrenched in the American social mindset, if you will, and in American culture. And so I think it's safe to say that the popular democratic perspective doesn't get as much attention in the debate. And so to sort of try to balance that out a little bit, I'm going to be focusing less on the elite democratic perspective in this lecture and more on the popular democratic perspective, because this is a rare opportunity for us to do a little talking about it and shed some light on it. And this is not an opportunity you might not otherwise have given the way, for example, the media operates. So now, who are the popular Democrats? Basically, as we've discussed last week, they are people originally like Thomas Jefferson and others who believed that the people should be trusted to make their own decisions politically, but that you needed to enable them. You needed to give them an education, right? So you needed them. The only way you could ever trust the masses would be to make sure that you've got a sort of a citizenship program in place, right? And then the masses will basically participate as well-meaning, well-intentioned citizens. Now, popular Democrats like Jefferson are clearly not opposed to the logic of the free market. So we shouldn't assume that just because they're saying what they're saying, that they're socialists or they're communists. Really, that type of thinking is not very popular in America at all. There's very, very few people who are authentically socialist or communist in the United States of America. So we should put that idea out of our heads, despite what Glenn Beck tells us. The primary difference between the elite Democrats and the popular Democrats when it comes to the economy is that where the elites see the state, the nation state, as intrinsically coercive, as we've argued, and the market, conversely, then as the domain of freedom, popular Democrats do see also a potential for a kind of coercion or abuse of power, at least, in the marketplace. So in this sense, the popular Democrats see the elite Democrats as a little bit idealistic or naive, right? Because they think only the state can be coercive and that the market's intrinsically free, where people are only ever just making free choices in the marketplace. What the popular Democrats are suggesting is that actually you can have huge distortions of power in the marketplace over time, especially as certain types of people get more wealthy and are able to use their surplus wealth to influence the way government works. So in order to address this, the popular Democrats suggest that there need to be institutions in place, democratic institutions, which can keep the market operating only where it ought to be operating, and that's in the private realm. That you don't want the market, you don't want decisions in the marketplace creeping out of the private realm into the public realm and influencing government, right? Because the decisions that they might have, the decisions they might make have huge implications and consequences for how we, for example, allocate production. If we want jobs in a certain area, but the corporation says, screw that, I'm moving to Mexico, and I want you to make new laws that allow me to do that and then sell my products cheaply back in the United States once I've made them in Mexico, then you have a problem, right? So corporations are able to request those laws and lobby for those laws because they have the resources to do so. They have huge advertising budgets, and they have people, professional staffers on hand who can help them speak to politicians and get those politicians on board with their ideas, whereas mom and pop business in downtown Chillicothe doesn't have anything like that kind of power. Just thinking about those small businesses in Chillicothe, they actually, in a way, do have to play the real market game, right? They have to work hard. They have to be industrious. They have to be enterprising. If they don't do those things, they're going to go out of business. But corporations like Walmart are actually a bit different to that. They have the money to give themselves a bit of a break, right? They can buy special favors. They can lobby, spend huge amounts of money, and use their power, their economic power, to influence on the federal, state, and local government level to get tax breaks. They can threaten federal, state, and local governments, for example, that they will leave if they don't get their way, right? If you don't give me a tax break, I'm going to move to another state. I'm going to move to Mexico. So in that sense, clearly they represent huge concentrations of power. And that's really the main reason why we say, from a popular democratic perspective, that the elite perspective on the markets as being somehow self-policing and a place where primarily good things happen is a bit naive. So the reality is in America that the top 10% of earners today own something like 80 to 90% of all the financial assets. And that really does give them a huge amount of power compared to the poor, right? If you earn over $150,000 today, you don't pay income tax on it at all. So, America's, really quite the opposite of anything like a socialist country, despite the fact that people like Glenn Beck get very fired up about the poor committing welfare fraud. Really, the system is very, very sort of generous to the rich. People complain about corporation taxes, for example, but the effective corporation tax, not the on paper corporation tax, but once you sort of look at all the favors that these corporations, the large corporations, have at their disposal from government, and you see that they get these tax breaks and these tax reductions on a one by one basis, that actually at the end of the day, corporation tax in this country are very, very low. So what do we do about these big companies, right? I mean, another example, just to sort of look at the impact they have on people's lives, is in the late 1990s, we have the company Enron, which was seen as one of the most successful companies in the world. It wasn't just an energy company, though it branded itself as that. In fact, Enron, as it developed, became a very sort of novel company, the first of its kind in some ways, which was trying to create novel ways in which average people could invest in it to trade futures in a vast number of commodities. This is not something that average Americans were able to do very much up to this point in time. Enron's idea was to be able to make it possible for all kinds of people to be able to trade in commodities. And Enron, of course, would benefit from that by taking a cut or making a profit from those commodities. And through its operations, Enron became the 7th largest company in the United States of America. However, as we saw in 2001, a lot of what Enron was doing turned out to be fraudulent, right? Its success was pretty much a lie. They were overstating their profits, and they were hiding their debts in small sort of side businesses that they were keeping on their books. So another thing that Enron did was it engaged in monopolistic practices in the California energy market. I don't know if any of you will be old enough to remember this, but if you do some research on it, you'll find it very easy to come up with some background story on this. Enron actually was paying energy traders in California to go to war with the electric companies to sort of get them to shut down, and this created a phenomena in California. This is going back to the early part of the last decade, where we had what were known as rolling blackouts. So people didn't have any electricity, often for hours at a row. And this was all being engineered by Enron traders in order to be able to jack up the price of electricity that they were charging to the state municipalities for their utilities. So, Enron was clearly doing some very, very dodgy things and corrupt things, often at the disadvantage of many Americans. So when the chickens came home to roost, Enron had a problem. And the problem, of course, was going to be the problem of the Enron employees and the people who had been having their electricity cut off. It wasn't going to be the problem of the top executives in the company. These executives knew that the company's finances were in fact misreported, and that really the company had no money at all, even though on paper it was the 7th biggest in the United States of America. So what did they do? Right before they knew the company was going to go bankrupt, they sold their stock. And it was a good thing for them that they did, because not long after that, the stock fell from $96 a share to 36 cents overnight. Now, the poor employees, they had invested in that stock largely for their pensions, and that was something that they had been encouraged and required to do by their employer. But those pensions, of course, were now going to be worthless. They were just worthless paper. They weren't going to be able to provide a robust pension for retirement. Now, some of those CEOs did go to jail, like Kenneth Lay, for example. but it still doesn't change the fact that the people who were, owed the money for their pensions were now not going to have much money to be able to depend on for their retirement. So a CEO going to jail, great, but it doesn't change anything for the majority of people. Now, of course, some reforms historically, we know the Clinton administration, the Bush administration were sort of interested in trying to do some regulations to make these CEOs a bit more accountable. And after the Enron collapse, there were reforms introduced. But just because the CEOs are now more accountable to their shareholders after those reforms doesn't change the fact that corporations today still have a lot of power. Now, that's a bit of a contrast to how things used to be. As we said in the introduction, it used to be that the U.S. economy was mostly local and agrarian, right? It was mostly agricultural. Corporations did exist, but they were tightly controlled. And all this started to change after the Civil War with the advent of some new technologies, specifically with railroads. The railroad companies were the first real large corporations that existed in America in the sense that we recognize them today. And John D. Rockefeller, a name from American history that I'm sure you've all heard of before, the famous Rockefeller Plaza in New York City, for example, he became what was known as a trust baron with the establishment of the Standard Oil Motor Company, which was based in Ohio. That meant that he was basically kind of operating as a kind of a monopolist. He consolidated a lot of different oil companies, and he could basically therefore set the price of oil as it appeared to the customer. Now, Ohio, the state, did try to regulate this trust, but then what happened, right? There's a thing called a full faith and credit clause in Article 4 of the Constitution. And because of the full faith and credit clause, that means that any corporation that operates in one state is allowed to operate legally in all of the states. And just because Ohio is going to try to regulate this John D. Rockefeller Trust, the Standard Oil Trust, didn't mean that he wasn't able to move somewhere else. And indeed he did. He moved to New Jersey. They were only too happy to have him, and they could raise a little bit of revenue from having him and his tax centered there. So that basically meant that no one state could get around this, and that the solution, if there was going to be any, had to come at the federal level. But the federal level is very, very influenced by corporate agendas. So then we see, and that is the sort of moment where we start to see the emergence of the powerful corporation as we know it today. And why is this an issue? Well, because corporations are effectively quite different to other types of businesses. In fact, we see there's this three basic sort of defining characteristics in the abstract that sort of define who they are and what they do. First of all, they feature joint stock ownership, which means a number of people can own them. Second, it means they have limited liability, which means that the people who work within them are not liable for any errors they make. Only the corporation itself is. That it has basically what we call a personhood. And this is a rather remarkable idea, and you'll see this mentioned in this week's supplemental readings as well, right? Because we're going to talk about Citizens United and whether corporations should have freedom of speech. Certainly, legally speaking, from an economic perspective, corporations are basically people. But they're people, unlike real people, they don't die, right? So corporations have what's thirdly called continuous legal identity, which means that even after all the people who work for it pass on, new people come and get employed by it all the time, and it has a perpetual identity on into the future. So what does all that mean? Well, it means that corporations, the bottom line, for all intents and purposes, that corporations are people. But as many psychologists would ask, if corporations are people, what kind of person are they, right? We have in psychological language various terms and categories for assessing the personality of real human in the flesh people. Some people we know have mental illnesses, for example. If corporations are persons, are all of them, mentally of clean bill of health? That's a very important question we may want to ask if we're going to treat people as persons. The Santa Clara case, Santa Clara County Railroad, is a crucial case in the history of establishing this claim that corporations are people. It said, in fact, that they have rights, and so that means that that they can claim responsibility for, and they can be held accountable for the things that they do, but not the people who work for them, interestingly enough, right? So if you're a CEO of a large corporation and you do something awful like dump a bunch of oil into the Gulf of Mexico and kill thousands and thousands of fish and marine wildlife, then the CEO is not going to be guilty of any sort of infraction there generally. In fact, the corporation will be held accountable. And then Citizens United case, which we will discuss later in the semester as a special case in its own right, is very important here, because now it says that corporations are not only people, and can be held accountable where the individual employees don't need to be held accountable, but also corporations have political freedom of speech, which means that they can engage in politicking and lobbying, not the right word lobbying, but campaigning closer to election time. They can actually put out adverts in favor of their most favored candidates. And of course, they have huge amounts of money. So that means that they can funnel all that money into trying to get their guy elected and trying to persuade people to get their guy elected. Now, if you don't support the corporations and you're trying to get elected, well, tough luck. That means that's a whole bunch of advertising that's going to be coming your way, saying bad things about you that you won't be able to afford a right to reply. So I think we'll stop it there, folks, for this part, and we'll start up again in just a little while with part 2.